Sorry, Darren.
It's live on Facebook now.
Is it? Okay. I'm not seeing it on my end. Okay.
I can see it's live, yeah.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum to all our listeners, viewers, and followers of our page. If you're not following our page, please do so. Today we have a very special episode. My co-host is Hannibal Shakur, who's a research contributor, special contributor and researcher for Milestones. I would like to introduce to you today's guest as Dr. Darren Byler, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Colorado. He researches the dispossession of ethno-racial Muslim minorities through forms of surveillance and digital capitalism in China and the global South. Darren is also a very frequent contributor, I must say, to Milestones, and it's always been consistent. So we really thank you, Darren, for your interaction with our journal. And we hope to see you more after this. I know we talked about a special, another one that where you're going to be the guest editor for a particular episode on Uyghur Muslims. So welcome to our show, Darren.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Great. So I would like to ask you right away, because it's Ramadan time and all the Muslims in the world are fasting. And I'd like to begin with a question about Islamic practice. What did it look like for Uyghurs in the past, and how did that change recently with the oppression and the different techniques of domination that's been going on in China on the Uyghur Muslims?
Yeah, so the Uyghurs are a group of around 12 million people in Northwest China. They're indigenous to the space where they live. It's their homeland. It's a huge space, a sixth the size of China. And in the past, they were Muslim. They have been Muslim for a millennium. They are Sunni Muslims. You know, Islam was brought to them along the Silk Road, because that's like the location that they live on. And their Islamic practice is very similar to other Central Asian peoples, like the Uzbeks. Their language is actually very similar to Uzbeks. So in the past, a lot of their social life centered around a mosque community. They are farmers and they're living in a sort of desert area. And so there's oasis spaces where they, set up their farms and their communities. And the mosque was the center of their life. So people I interviewed when I did my research in that region would tell me when they were growing up, like most people didn't have a watch on their hand. They didn't have a clock. And so they told time by the call to prayer. Like they would say, okay, I'll meet you after, second prayer or whatever. That was like what organized their life. They would be, going to the mosque on a regular basis. There was Islamic teachers that would teach them in the mosque. Of course, it was restricted during the Maoist period when China really claimed the Uyghur region for the first time and in a really serious way after 1949. And so for about 20 years, it was difficult to practice Islam, but it was still there. And then in the 80s and 90s, it really resurged, came back in a way that was quite similar to before. Beyond the so-called local communities, the larger mosques, the Friday mosques, is how Uyghurs refer to them, are in the kind of larger urban areas, and people would go there on Fridays for larger gatherings. The sort of more famous Islamic teachers would be in those mosques, and that's where they would receive messages. And there was also bazaar spaces there. So after Friday prayers, then they would go to the bazaar. It was like a way that the community really came together. Then beyond that, there's also shrine visitation. So Uyghurs have a very strong Sufi tradition, and a lot of their Islamic practice centered around going to these shrines where they would, on particular days of the year, where people from the larger region would meet, and they would celebrate the bringer of Islam that was was buried in that shrine.
Mhm.
So those were the sorts of things that really held the community together.
Mhm.
That really began to change in 1997 when there was a protest in relation to large-scale arrests of Uyghurs who had been like gathering to try to fund Islamic education. There's lots of restrictions on Islamic education, and so in response to that incident where there was violence, several dozen people were killed at least. We don't know for sure exactly how many people killed by the police. The police and the government said you can no longer have public gatherings. And so that meant that the shrines were closed very quickly. And then those neighborhood mosques started to be shut down. There was new prohibitions on teaching children about Islam in their homes. Eventually it became restrictions on practice of fasting during Ramadan. All of these things began to kind of pile up on top of each other. So it's really just in the last decade, 2 decades, that these restrictions on Islamic practice have become a huge part of Uyghurs' experience of Islamic practice. That there's so much that they're not permitted to do.
Okay, yeah, that's very serious. That history of earlier and the Maoist period. I like the way you periodized the whole problem that we're faced with right now. I would like to see if Hannibal has questions for you, and then come back to some questions that you brought up.
Yeah. So considering these crackdowns and the way that they're being policed in this way, what effect did technology have on their religious knowledge practice, as well as how was technology used to criminalize them as Uyghurs in Islam?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, despite all of these restrictions on Islamic practice, that they were no longer permitted to teach their children about Islam. The smaller neighborhood mosques were being closed. Local leaders were being arrested before teaching in those neighborhood mosques. Despite all of those things, people continued to practice Islam. It just took different forms. They did it in different ways. And so children would still learn about Islam. They would learn to read the Quran. Often during summer vacation, they would go to so in the neighborhood, there might be 1 or 2 people that had studied Arabic in the past, and they would teach them. So they would go over to that person's house and they would learn during the summer. But they knew that to keep it secret. So during the school year, often their teachers would ask them, have you ever studied the Quran? Do your parents teach you about Islam in your house? And they would know that the right answer is to say no. So they would say no. So it kind of went underground in some ways. And then in 2011, 3G networks were instituted throughout, were established throughout the whole region. And along with it, of course, smartphones. And so that was really the first time that Uyghurs that live in rural areas were able to get online and were able to really access computer technology. So prior to this, in the areas around the Friday mosques, in the more urban centers, there was kind of internet cafes where people could go and get online. But it was something that young people did. They mostly played games and stuff. They didn't really use computers as a tool for learning. Mm-hmm. But with the smartphones, people for the first time really began to access sort of the internet and the World Wide Web, and really come in contact with sort of the broader Muslim community. So there was Uyghurs that had moved abroad, mm-hmm. moved to Kazakhstan, moved to Turkey, moved to Egypt, and those, especially in Turkey and in Egypt, were in often cases, at least for sure in the second generation, but sometimes in the first 2, really studying Islam. That was one of the reasons why they went to live abroad, is because they wanted a free space to learn about Islam. And so some of those people became important religious teachers for Uyghurs back in the homeland. They started to download their messages on an app called WeChat, which is a Chinese app that's similar to WhatsApp. Mm-hmm. and initially it seemed like that's fine, like the government wasn't really stopping it. I mean, occasionally if one of these Islamic teachers would get like more than like 5,000 followers or something, then the government would notice and they would shut that person's like news feed down. But in general, like these things were permitted. And so after 2011, we saw lots and lots of Uyghurs really begin to develop followings around these Islamic teachers. Well, most of what they were teaching was just very normal Muslim stuff, like what is halal, what is haram, what are the basic teachings that we should know about. It was things that they couldn't get access to in the mosques because the mosques were being closed. And in the Friday mosques, which were still open, the teachers, their messages, which they would give during the Friday prayers or after Friday prayer, they were censored by the state. So they were basically government messages about how not to be Muslim or things like that. So people understood that what they're hearing in the mosque is not real Islam. That's how they talked about it. This is not real Islam. We're learning about real Islam online.
Can I just interject there? Like, do you have any examples of things they might have mentioned that they had identified as like, this is coming from the state, this is really not Islamic?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that like these Islamic teachers in the Friday mosque, who are basically government employees, were saying is like, we should support the Xi Jinping administration. We need to, foster ethnic harmony. We should welcome Han people into our homes. You shouldn't be too strict about halal and haram ideas. Like they said, like it's okay to like abstain from eating pork and things like that. But like they didn't want it to like kind of get out into the broader way of how people kind of consume things and kind of live their lives. Because one of the things that Uyghurs were starting to do is they were starting to really emphasize sort of local products, because they said you really can't trust the things that these Han people are making and selling to us, like tea or water even. So like they started to like advertise their local water, like that they would bottle as like halal water. And that was something that the state was like really worried about. They thought about it as like the halalification of Uyghur society, that they're becoming so Muslim, so radicalized. A lot of it though was more, I think, in the state teaching versus Uyghur teaching, what had to do with dress. So like, what they were learning from the Islamic teachers abroad was that like, men in other Muslim societies, they have beards, they dress in certain ways, women veil themselves in certain ways. And that, began to be a real source of tension, because according to the state, like there's a permitted way of dressing that's appropriate for your like ethnicity. Like Uyghurs were allowed to have like a sort of, it's a prayer hat, a dopa, how it's called in Uyghur. It's like a traditional form. And that was okay, at least in some contexts, but any other form of a dopa or prayer cap was not permitted. Men were not allowed to have beards under the age of 55. That eventually became the rule. Initially, a lot of these things are just like sort of informal rules. Like, what's wrong. The teachers are kind of telling you what's the right thing to do, but it's not like formalized in the law. And eventually it was actually put into the law. So those are the sorts of things that were in the air and what people were talking about. The reason why they couldn't actually track what people were saying online was because they were using Uyghur language, which is a Turkic language. It was oral speech. And so it's actually kind of a way of sort of hacking the censorship like protocols that are in place in China, because they just didn't have the tools to get after that oral speech. They couldn't really figure out what people were saying. I mean, they could do it if they would listen to each message, and if someone who understood Uyghur listened to each message, but they couldn't automate the censorship. They couldn't automate the detection. And if everyone is using oral messaging, it's just really hard to track. And oral messaging also really had a real appeal to Uyghurs, because many of them have kind of varying degrees of formal education when it comes to written text, but everyone can speak. So, and also one of the big issues with a computer interface or smartphone interface is that initially there wasn't an alphabet or there wasn't a keyboard to use Uyghur written language. And so it was really complicated to write. But everyone could speak, and so it really allowed people to access knowledge in a new way. Also, it really kind of coincides with the sort of the way that people learn. As in Uyghur traditional society, there's a really strong emphasis on sort of ustaz-shagird relationship. Ustaz is like a master, and a shagird is like an apprentice. And so most of the teaching is done orally in all aspects of life. Like even if you're learning a trade, like how to be like a tinsmith or someone who's a farmer, whatever, like all of that knowledge is taught orally. It's not, you know, you don't learn it in school. And the same when it comes to Islamic instruction, it was done orally. And so all of those things combined really made the internet and smartphones and WeChat a really, really, you know, valuable tool for Uyghurs to learn about Islam. And because the state wasn't really controlling it, or didn't seem to be, it seemed like maybe it's an okay sort of public-private space where we can talk about Islam, we can talk about politics, all of these things. And so it really began to really kind of reorganize Uyghur society in some ways. I should also mention that, you know, at the same time that all of this is happening, the Uyghur region itself was really was being occupied by Han people that were moving there in large numbers, beginning in the 90s and 2000s. And that's because around 20% of Chinese oil and natural gas are from this region. And today, you know, a huge percentage of Chinese cotton comes from this region as well. So it became sort of this space for settler colonization. And so like the Uyghurs like kind of turned to the internet, turned to Islam in these ways, was in some ways a response to what they were feeling in their life. They're being dispossessed of their land, dispossessed of their way of life. And so this was one way of sort of responding and kind of maintaining control of their society. Another thing that they were, you know, becoming increasingly desperate to find was reliable jobs or ways of finding a way forward in the new economy, because with all of those settlers moving in, the cost of living itself was beginning to rise. But Uyghurs were being excluded from the new economy. They weren't given jobs in the oil or natural gas sector at all. 99% of those jobs are going to these Han settlers. And they were in some cases being pushed into sort of sharecropper positions in the cotton industry. But it wasn't like enough to really provide for their children and to, you know, provide for a better way of life. And so people were going to the city, starting to, in greater numbers, go to the city, oftentimes organizing themselves through WeChat when they got to the city. Like that's how you made connections with each other. You find a mosque community based on your WeChat network. And that's really how things, you know, how you organize your kind of religious economy. Another thing that they started to do at the same time as all of this is, because all the mosque spaces were being closed, Islamic teaching, like, you know, in kind of face-to-face interaction had to happen in other places. And so we started to see Uyghurs going to, they would have an Islamic teacher come to a wedding or to a funeral. And so after the wedding or during that process, there would be a period of time where the Islamic teacher would teach, and a lot of people would go to the funeral or wedding for the Islamic teacher rather than for I mean, they would also go for the funeral and the wedding, but like there would be a larger crowd that would come because they were interested in hearing what people were talking about in that space. And the funerals and weddings happen in people's homes, so they're less controlled. There's not, you know, at least in most cases, not camera systems, and, you know, the government wasn't there, at least initially. And so that became a space for Islamic teaching. They also, in the restaurants around mosques, began to open up prayer rooms where people would talk about Islam. They would share messages using like the Bluetooth on their phone. They also started to publish things digitally, and they would share those written texts there. So technology itself really began to reshape social life and religious practice in many ways, at least between, you know, up until 2014, 2015.
Hannibal, did you have a question or? So let me quickly then ask. I think Hannibal, did you ask a question about criminalization of Uyghurs and?
Yeah. So I was asking, you know, how about technology and
Yeah.
how it's being used to criminalize Uyghur Islam.
Right. So maybe I didn't really get into actually how they use it to criminalize it. So
Right.
maybe I can keep going with that.
Yeah,
So
that would be great.
after May 2014, which is when the state declared what they call the People's War on Terror, that was really it was to target the Uyghurs. It was in response, at least officially, to a number of violent incidents carried out by Uyghurs. In one case, a family of Uyghurs drove an SUV into a crowd of tourists in Tiananmen Square in Beijing in 2013. It killed a number of tourists. Our understanding is that the family came from this place in northwest China, from the Uyghur region, and that there was a dispute with the local officials about adding new space onto the mosque where they were worshiping. And so it was in response to a local incident. Of course, it was carried out in this other place, and it had a lot of the markings of what people talk about as terrorism. And because it was happening in the symbolic space, kind of the center of political power in China, it's like, happening in front of the White House in the US or something. It really got people's attention and made the state really feel like, oh, we have a problem with the Uyghurs. Because they've been cracking down on the Uyghurs for years and years and years. I mean, like, police brutality was widespread. Like, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs had been killed on the street, just shot, by the police for protesting, for resisting arrest, any of those sorts of things. So it was already quite brutal. But because the Uyghurs were beginning to kind of lash out outside of the Uyghur region, and now it looked like targeting civilians. First in Tiananmen Square, then there was another incident at a train station with over 30 people killed in a kind of coordinated knife attack. That's why the state declared this People's War on Terror. Of course, it wasn't only like those incidents were carried out by a really small number of people, and most Uyghurs didn't even know that those things happened or where like how and why they happened. They felt like this had nothing to do with them. Most Uyghurs were not, wouldn't condone attacking civilians. So anyway, there was a real disconnect between the response, the People's War on Terror, and the actual violent activity. Most of what they were actually concerned with was something more than simply violence. It was piety in the religious practice. So they were concerned that Uyghurs were becoming too Muslim. They said, this one Uyghur official I interviewed told me that he's afraid that the Uyghurs are becoming like the Taliban. Seeing the Talibanization of the Uyghurs. And that was, because the young men were like growing beards and women were veiling themselves. And so therefore, if people look that way, they must be like proto-terrorists. That's basically the mindset of the officials in the region. And so the way that the People's War on Terror was actually expressed was as a sort of, they called it a de-extremification campaign, to de-radicalize the population. And so the way that they actually carried it out was through technology, because Uyghurs speak a different language. They're very different from the authorities, from the police in many cases. And so to actually assess what people are doing, they needed ways of like kind of understanding it and kind of cracking the code. And so the way that they did it is they used new tools that would automate the transcription and translation of Uyghur spoken audio. Because remember that they were using the oral communication on WeChat. Now they could go back through their digital history and figure out what people were saying. They were also looking through images, through text for any of these kind of flagged items. And in some cases, it was just simply like, having installed an app that was now illegal. So having installed WhatsApp on your phone, or using a VPN, which is a virtual proxy network, which allows you to connect outside of the censorship system. All of those things were used as evidence that this person was an extremist and needed to be re-educated. They also began to control people's movement and their behavior using a system of checkpoints, which is really similar to how in Israel, Palestine, in the West Bank and in Gaza, how they control people's movement there. They actually were learning directly from the Israelis how to do this stuff. So they instituted these checkpoints. At the height of the checkpoint building, there was kind of at every jurisdictional boundary. So as you move through the city, you would go through numerous checkpoints. If you go into any institution like a bank or a shopping mall, you would have your face scanned and then matched to your ID, the image that's on your ID. And so people would get their ID checked, 10 times a day or more. So all of those things began to really control people's movement. And then in addition, they began to install these massive networks of cameras, which at a certain point, began to utilize forms of face recognition. And so they were tracking people's movement through space in between those checkpoints. And people began to understand that if they appear in a certain way, if they look Islamic at all, like they're going to be stopped immediately. And so all of this stuff really began to control people's behavior, their religious behavior. And so technology really began to sort of criminalize forms of Islamic expression.
I want to just kind of push a little bit, in that direction a little bit more. Because you already started talking about criminalization in relation to the war on terror. I wanted to know a little bit more about, because the global Muslim audience may not understand that in China, there is a good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative as well. And how is that working? How is that narrative being used for sort of countering violent extremism, that kind of project that China has? If you could kind of emphasize that a little bit. And the other one, just joint questions, you just now mentioned about sort of like the Israelization of how the Uyghurs are being dominated and using the checkpoints and that kind of like settler colonial style of management of population. If you could emphasize those two things a little bit from your research and give us some observations, that would be very helpful.
Sure. Yeah, so it's important to understand that in China, there's two major Muslim groups. There's the Turkic Muslims, which are Uyghurs and Kazakhs. There's 12 million Uyghurs, 1.5 million Kazakhs. Then there's smaller groups of Turkic Muslims like Uzbeks and Turkmen and Tatars. But those are the sort of major groups in the Turkic Muslim population. And then there's another group called the Hui Muslims, which are Chinese Muslims that have really more assimilated with the kind of mainstream population in China. So the major differences are that the Hui folks don't have sort of a historical homeland that they call their own. They're mostly an urban population that lives in many different places throughout the country, whereas the Uyghurs, they have this homeland that is theirs, that has been their native land for a long time. The same with the Kazakhs in the northern part of the Uyghur region. So that's one difference. The other difference is they speak a different language. Uyghurs and Kazakhs speak this Turkic language as their first language, and for some of them it's their only language, whereas Hui people speak Chinese, they speak Mandarin. And then there's a third component, which is because this Hui population has assimilated over many generations into the main population of China, they can pass as Han. So they look quite similar to Han people. It's mostly, the difference is primarily religious and cultural. So how people dress is what marks them as different when it comes to Hui versus Han. Uyghurs, on the other hand, they look different. Their racial phenotypes do not match with Han folks. And so even if they learn to speak Mandarin, perfectly fluently, they can never pass as Han. And so they're always looked at as different, and is looked at either, with a kind of exoticism, like this person is like really interesting because they're different, or they're looked at as potentially dangerous. And most of it is potentially dangerous, especially for Uyghur men. So those are major differences, a kind of racialization, a linguistic difference, and also this like an attachment to a homeland. The Hui people are often described as good Muslims because they fit in with mainstream society. They don't, advocate for their own homeland. Whereas Uyghurs, historically have been described as bad Muslims because they want their own homeland and they look different, they talk different, and then more recently, they've begun to dress in ways that are not permitted by the government. Hui people are also, like Uyghurs, beginning to connect themselves to a greater extent with the broader Muslim community. And so they are also starting to dress slightly differently. And that's also become troubling to the Chinese state and to the general public. And so there's sort of like increasing forms of Islamophobia that increasingly even the good Muslim part of the Hui people is being kind of taken over by the bad Muslim part. And so in general, Islamophobia is really kind of now institutionalized in China. It's something that the mainstream talks about often, is that like the Muslims are taking over. They want everything to be halal, all this sort of thing. So that's one thing that's happening. In terms of like how the terror discourse entered China, prior to 2001 and September 11th, Uyghurs were not ever described as terrorists, or very rarely. There was no terrorism in China before 2001. Instead, Uyghurs were described as separatists, that they wanted to have their own state. So it was primarily about an ethnic difference. After 2001, the Chinese state moved in a matter of several weeks to work with the U.S. administration and others, European administrations, to label a Uyghur group that was living in Afghanistan and Pakistan as a terrorist group. So the East Turkestan Party or Islamic movement very quickly was labeled a terrorist group. And then the Chinese state began to talk about Uyghurs in China as terrorists. So very quickly, things that otherwise were, basically political protests or, social protests, if someone's land is taken so they can, drill for oil or, get at the natural gas or get at coal, of course you're going to protest. But now that was described as a terrorist event. So all the kind of ways of getting justice through the legal system were cut off. Like civil rights were really damaged very quickly by the terror discourse. So Uyghurs were placed in this kind of state of exception where like the normal rules don't apply, their citizenship rights are not valid because they're always sort of pre-terrorists or terrorists. So that's how it began to enter the discourse. Then, as the war on terror, global war on terror progressed, the policing theorists in China began to, they were always watching what was happening. And they began to think, well, if we have Uyghur terrorists, like how do we actually deal with them? We must kind of adapt a sort of counterinsurgency theory that's being used in other places. And so they were like looking at the Petraeus doctrine, which was being used in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the way that you control populations and transform them, and especially insurgent populations. And so they were really interested in thinking about full spectrum intelligence. So in order to really understand a population, we need to like know everything that they're doing. And after 2011, and they were using WeChat to talk about Islam and all of that, they realized, oh, we really need these technological tools to get access to it. And so that became a really important point of focus. And just to make sure that all of you understand what counterinsurgency theory is really trying to do, is trying to develop sort of total knowledge of a population in order to sort of break the social network, the social fabric of the society. And so that's really why in Iraq we started to see this new category of detainee emerge, where people that were suspected of being insurgents, they didn't really have evidence, but they took them anyway. They were sent to these camps and held without charge for long periods of time. That's the first part. And then the next thing that they try to do is they try to win the hearts and minds of the population. which is a really hard thing to do when you're like conducting a war on that population, occupying their space, and then you're trying to win their hearts and minds. The way that they tried to do it is through, building infrastructure like roads and giving people access to water and all of that. I'm talking about in Afghanistan and Iraq, and also education. And then there's usually also sort of saving the women component to this as well, where you like using kind of an imperialist framework of thinking about how women ought to be defined from a Western perspective, without asking women themselves what they want. You begin to liberate them in certain ways. Anyway, that same sort of dynamic very quickly took hold in the Chinese discourse about what they needed to do. It just took them some time to really operationalize it and figure out exactly how to do it. But that's how it began. In the counterinsurgency in Iraq, the way that Petraeus and these other people, when they're deciding who should be detained, they were trying to figure out, who are the active insurgents, who's the neutral population that could go either way, and then who are the sort of safe population, the trustworthy people, and the people that you can use as informants. And in the Chinese case, they did the same thing. So in 2017, they went kind of house to house and interviewed Uyghurs to figure out, who is trustworthy, who is normal, or that's the term that they use in Chinese, is Iban, and who is unsafe. And so through that process, they categorized these people in these different ways. The way they determined it was using 10 basic categories. The first was, what is the person's age? Are they of military age, 15 to 55? Are they Uyghur? Are they underemployed? Those are kind of three sort of existential categories that they started out with. So for each category that applied to you, you're deducted 10 points. And you move from the sort of safe position to the normal position. Then on top of that, there's questions about religious practice. Does the person pray daily? Do they have unauthorized religious knowledge? Do they teach their children about Islam in their home? So each of those categories count 10 minus 10 as well. And then there's questions about their social network. Does this person have family members that are living abroad? Have they ever traveled to a Muslim majority country? Those types of questions. So very quickly, large numbers of the Uyghur population were pushed from the sort of safe category to the normal category or to the unsafe category. And of course, the unsafe people were the people that needed to be detained. And I think the policing authorities didn't understand that so many people would be pushed into that unsafe category. And so it turned out that, almost 10%, 20% of the population turned out to be unsafe and had to be re-educated, had to be detained. So that was how the counterinsurgency theory was sort of implemented. In addition to that, they also began to occupy people's homes, especially of the people that were detained, to monitor their behavior and make sure that they're not practicing Islam any longer. And then they also began to sort of, the win the hearts and minds part of this was to introduce poverty alleviation programs, which were basically, sending people to work in factories at low wages. So the main thing that came out of this, of course, and what most of you have probably heard about is, the camp system, how people were sent to live in these camps as a result of being labeled unsafe.
That's extremely insightful, and there's lots of information to process. I want to switch a little bit. I'll get back to the war question, but I wanted to ask you about, you spoke a little bit about how they tried to kind of survive and subvert some of these technologies of violence that are used against them. If you could tell us a little bit, I know how difficult that might be in such a situation of centralized control of life. If there is Uyghur resistance to, or how the community is responding to this kind of surveillance system. And of course, we know about the camps, and those are questions we're going to ask later. But how are the Uyghur people trying to survive and respond to the Chinese people's war on terror?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, people are quite resilient, so they find ways to survive. And in the past, the Maoist period, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they also couldn't practice Islam very openly during that period. So there's sort of historical memory of how to survive. The difficulty here, though, is that power is so centralized, it's so omnipresent, you can't escape it. So like when the people I interviewed said, like, during the Cultural Revolution, it was terrible. Like, we had to go to all these struggle sessions and denounce family members and things like this, or denounce Islam. But at least at home, we were safe. It's at home, like, we were still secure, and so we could still, practice Islam in our home. Now they said that's not even that is no longer possible, because they're having these people visit them in their home. They're always worried about the surveillance systems. There's cameras set up right outside the door of their house. And family separation is now really widespread. So, parents are separated from their children. Children are being taken to boarding schools. So it makes it really difficult in a much more kind of comprehensive way to practice Islam.
Mm-hmm.
But still, people find ways to do it. So the people I talk to would say, like, we learned how to pray on the inside, like, so pray without showing it, or we pray sitting up now. They have, like, there's lots of tests, especially during Ramadan, to make sure that people aren't fasting. So like, they make it like the students at a university, like, line up and like drink in front of the teachers. And so people would bring their own, like, teacup, which is like it's like a thermos, but it's not clear, so you can't tell if there's anything inside or not. And so they would, like, pretend to drink, and, like, the teacher would say, well, it looked like he drank, and so they would let them go. And so, like, those are the kind of the techniques that people use to kind of get outside of the system. I mean, they would also, just secretly not eat, but if they're forced to, then it's really hard not to. People understand that if the government is making you do things that are against your will, like that you have no choice and you have to do that. That there's ways of practicing Islam even while you're being forced to violate certain tenets of it, and so they adapt in those ways. But it's increasingly difficult.
Yeah, so it's thinking about the stuff you're saying, it kind of naturally brings us to this other question that I wanted to ask. And you mentioned earlier about the specific kind of targeting of Uyghur men, and as well as this kind of idea of them as like this ethnic separatist group, which is really interesting to me to think about, because we recently had a scholar on our program, Dr. Tommy Curry, and he was discussing with us social dominance theory and how it relates to outgroup males, like specific minority group males, and the way that they're treated as a threat, or the way that they're sort of policed in a way to kind of suppress their influence. So I was curious if you think this plays a role there, or even more specifically, how you think it plays a role there. What are some of the ways that this plays out specifically for Uyghur men?
So the primary target of the campaign, the re-education campaign and the camp system, is Uyghur men, young men. Probably 75% or 60, 2/3 to 3/4 of the population of people in the camps are young men. And they've been targeted directly because they are seen as the primary threat when it comes to forms of resistance to the state. They're also often the kind of primary providers for families. They're the ones that are doing the farm work, or if they're involved in some sort of business, they're the ones that have the primary income in the family. And so it's a way of sort of fracturing the family structure as well, and making women and children more susceptible to state kind of paternalism, state intervention. So the men are definitely targeted, and there's a whole history to Uyghur men being seen as major threats to public security throughout China. Because Uyghurs were excluded from the normal economy, they weren't given jobs. They were often pushed into a sort of gray economy, which meant that they were buying and selling things, working as traders, kind of at the margins of society. They, in some cases, got involved in drug trade, working with networks, and people that are in Afghanistan or across the border from Myanmar. And so that sort of stereotype of Uyghur men is that they're like drug dealers or they're criminals. And so often, if a Uyghur man would go into a store or an elevator, like the Han people that would be in that space would, like, especially if they're women, would grab their purses. They might be followed when they walk inside a store, and because they think they might steal something. A lot of the sort of racialized stereotypes that young men and Black and brown men face in many places in the world were attached to the Uyghur men. There's a whole kind of wilding discourse that's associated with them. That they're just simply crazy people that will have no moral compass, and they'll just cut you with their knives or whatever. The typical way that Uyghur men were talked about in the city was they called them balangza, which is, at least in some contexts, a way of talking about it as being like wolf children, because in Chinese, langza is like it's a wolf, and bala is how Uyghurs are referred to. It means child. So they're like these wolf children that are just feral. They're just roaming the streets and willing to do anything. You have to be fearful of them. If you see them in a dark alley, you should run away.
This is like reminiscent of a while back when Hillary Clinton was talking about super predators, and those young men in Central Park that spent all that time in prison behind something they never did. It was like that exact same narrative of just making that observation. It's really interesting.
Yeah. So you can see it's the kind of parallels are pretty obvious. Of course, they don't have a history of slavery in China that we have here in the U.S., and so the racialization is slightly different. It has it's a younger history, but it is definitely there, and it's definitely a part of why they needed to sort of militarize and turn this camp system into something that was more of a prison system, and mass incarceration is now a huge part of this whole story. So mass incarceration has been a problem for Uyghurs for a long time. Already they were disproportionately detained, and they're not given proper representation. The court is totally set up against them.
So when now,
go ahead.
So I was gonna ask, while you're on that subject of mass incarceration, when they're incarcerated, they're being incarcerated in these camps that we're told about.
So initially they were incarcerated in regular prisons. So there was a kind of labor camps and regular prisons, that are maximum security prisons. They're given long sentences. Often the charge was they said that they're guilty of hate crimes, which always, a hate crime is always a minority person acting in a violent way towards a majority person. So it's never the other direction. And oftentimes it wasn't actually, even about the ethnicity. It was about, their land being taken, or, forms of discrimination they experienced on the street. If there was ever an incident of violence, the Uyghur person was always guilty, and the Han person was always innocent, regardless of what actually happened. So the system was set up against them. Then the camp system on top of that, detained an extra million or so people. So already, hundreds of thousands of Uyghur men had been sent to prison prior to the camp system being built. So the Uyghur men are seen as the primary threat. They're seen as the ones that are, the carriers of Islam as well, the ones that are the most dangerous, the most, kind of terror prone or terrorism prone. They're seen as the people that have to be controlled and tamed or broken in some way. They're also seen as disposable. So like they in many ways, this camp system is set up as a sort of human warehousing. Like they just want to put these people somewhere outside of kind of mainstream society and sort of forget about them, and then work on the children and the women who are left in these communities. So they think that like, go ahead.
What's happening in these camps? What does it mean to be put in a camp? Like what does it mean for a young Uyghur man to be put in a camp? What is life like for him once he's placed there?
So, after you're detained, oftentimes because of a scan on your phone or, someone else who has been detained says, they're being tortured as they're being interrogated. During that experience, they might say, well, this other person is the person who told me about, they shared this message with me or something like that. So then you're detained, you're investigated for a bit, and then they decide if you need to be given a criminal sentence in a prison or being sent to the camp. So oftentimes there's sort of a plea deal. So you accept to be sent to the camp as a way of getting out of a longer prison sentence. That's typically how it works. The camp space, so people don't know how long they're being held there because there's no formal sentence. Typically when they arrive, they put like a black plastic bag or a canvas bag of some sort, almost always black, over their head. Their hands are shackled. They understand that this is like a prison context, even though the guards are telling them that you're going to the school. So it's not a normal school in any way. Inside the camp, they're mostly held inside small cells that are like, maybe 15 feet by 30 feet in diameter. There's typically bunk beds inside the cell. They're not allowed to sit on the bunk bed except during the permitted sleeping hours. Lights are never turned off. The lights are on really bright, and at least in some contexts, there's a sort of face recognition component to the camera systems inside the cells. So they're not allowed to cover their face with their hand or to put a blanket over their face, just because the lights are so bright. During the day, they sit on the small plastic stools for hours and hours at a time. They're often shown videos on the flat screen TV that's mounted up on the wall. It's usually speeches from Xi Jinping, who's the prime minister of, or the premier of China. Sometimes the things that they're hearing are more ideologically or politically driven, and sometimes it's more about learning Chinese language. So there's two main components to the education, which is politics and language. When they come into the cell, they're told to memorize a set of rules. Oftentimes the rules are posted on the side of the cell, and one of them is usually I no longer believe in Islam or something like that. I no longer believe in religion, something to those effects. So there's kind of a component of denouncing your Islamic faith that's built into it. The cameras are everywhere, even in the bathroom. People told me that over time, you just get used to the cameras being everywhere, watching everything. During mealtime, they are asked to stand at attention and sing patriotic songs or the national anthem. And all of the cells typically sing at the same time. And they're being watched on the cameras while they sing. And if one cell doesn't sing as loudly as they're supposed to, then they are forced to sing again. So sometimes people said that they would sing, 20 or 30 or 40 times before they would be fed. Typically the food is a bowl of some kind of rice porridge. It's not a lot of sustenance. And because they're pushed in, they're made to sit in this one position for hours and hours at a time, it really wrecks people's digestive system, especially older folks. And so a lot of people develop sort of digestive issues associated with this. In some cases, they're also not allowed to use the bathroom for long periods of time. That means that they're being watched while they use the bathroom, especially if the bathroom is outside of the cell, typically only 2 minutes per day. And so like, if you're constipated, like because of your diet and the way you've been sitting, it's really horrific. And so those are the kinds of discomforts and like kind of banal everyday experiences of being sort of slowly kind of tortured in this way. Then during the week, there's often some classroom activity. So they're taken outside of the cell for periods of time where they receive more sort of instruction with the teacher. The teacher is usually positioned behind a sort of fence or like a cage at the front of the classroom. And the people are assigned a particular seat that they have to sit at each time. The seats are really narrow so that they can't actually move or get up easily. And they're taught, basic Chinese. So it doesn't really matter what kind of Chinese they had when they came in. Like if they knew some Chinese before, they're still just taught like the basics. They're taught like kindergartners. So there's a kind of paternalism that's there as well. Like people feel like it's not actually about learning Chinese or anything. It's just about sort of instilling terror and fear and submission in these people. One of the people I interviewed, a Kazakh man, said that one of the moments that was always hardest for him was occasionally, maybe once a month, their relatives will be allowed to visit them in like a visitation room. And prior to going into that room, which is like in another building, the person would be shackled and have the hood put over their head. The guards are always carrying like non-lethal weapons with them. Sometimes it's like a cattle prod or like some sort of electric stunning device. Other times it's like a wooden club. And they march them to this space. And right before they go into this, the visitation area, they take off the thing that's over their head. They take off the shackles, and the guards hide those weapons, and they take them inside. Just like as if they're just like their teacher, just like their friend. And then their relative is sitting there, and the guards are right beside them, and so they have to tell them, everything is great. I'm learning so much. The school is wonderful. The government is just taking care of us. They're feeding us so well. Like everything they have to say is a lie. And I think oftentimes their relatives understand that it's a lie, but just being forced to like enact that over and over again is just so traumatic, because what this guy told me is like, you lose your ability to speak, for yourself. You can only speak what the government wants you to say. And that kind of like violation of their, being, their autonomy as a human person is just really traumatic. So those are the sorts of things that happen in the camp. Over time, eventually, if you progress through the system, which means you learn Chinese, you're able to pass tests of like your political ideology. In some cases, they're permitted to move from the camp space to factory spaces that are associated with the camp. It often seems really arbitrary though, in terms of who gets to move. It seems as though, the people that would be the best workers are the ones that are taken first. And also has something to do with like kind of the politics of the local space. Like how many people are coming to the camp? Is it getting too overcrowded? Oftentimes there's lots of overcrowding, 20 or 30 people to a single cell, which means that in some cases they have to share like a single bunk bed, like two people, like they have to sleep like head to toe with the other person because they're not allowed to talk to each other. But it's so overcrowded, really horrible conditions. There's also a dehumanizing aspect to this as well. Like that's how the guards, I think, cope with it, is they start to treat these people as like kind of subhuman. So on numerous occasions, the people I interviewed said, the guards would just call us animals. They would say, you're not a human person anymore. If you were human, you wouldn't be here. Like, this is a space only for animals. And so they would, hit them with sticks, these clubs, or with the stunning devices, if they would kind of step out of line, and then they would call them, get back in line, animal, that sort of thing. So there's a way that all of this is how you actually cope with this sort of treatment of people is by otherizing them in really extreme ways.
Your project title is Terror Capitalism, and I'm assuming there's a huge emphasis on the economic dimension. Would you tell us a little bit about the economic drivers of the camp system?
Yeah, so the probably primary driver at this point is the factory work that's associated with the camps now. So a certain percentage of the camps have been closed, and the population that was in the camp has now been transferred to factories that are in the same space as the camp, or sometimes nearby, in other cases across the country. So large numbers of people are now working in garment and textile manufacturing in these factory spaces. Not only the people that were in the camp, but also what they call surplus laborers, people that were left behind in the villages. They're also now being sent to work in these factories. So that's one of the drivers that's come out of this. But probably, what actually kind of facilitated and really got the ball rolling with all of this was the technology development. So the state, gave hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts to private technology firms to build the security systems, the surveillance systems, those tools that extract data from people's smartphones, to figure out their digital history. They hired close to 100,000 private contractors to work as police. So it became a sort of security industrial complex that really became the central element of the economy in this region, and also became sort of an incubator for the tech industry in China itself. So China wants to become, wants to compete with the US, wants to compete with the world in terms of their technology development. They want by 2030 to really set standards when it comes to artificial intelligence and other forms of technology. So this space where they're kind of building out all of this technology infrastructure, especially the sort of computer vision forms of technology, which is face recognition systems, voice recognition, all of that. Having an experimental space, experimental group of people where you can develop these tools really gives them a way of sort of operationalizing things that otherwise might just be in labs back in Eastern China. So it's similar to the way the US developed a lot of their technology, is through a military industrial complex, through NASA, other kind of state-funded programs. China is doing something similar. And this war space, this People's War on Terror space in Northwest China is one of the spaces where they're doing that. So those are some of the drivers. I think a third element that comes out of this is a kind of dispersal and settlement dynamic. So many of the Uyghurs are now being sent to other parts of China to work in factories, also still tightly controlled in sort of prison-like environments. And at the same time as that's happening, many Han people are being moved into the Uyghur space, that's being left behind. And so it's a new form of settlement and dispersal. So it's a way of kind of finalizing the forms of settler colonialism that were already in motion.
When you were describing the camps and life in the camps, obviously, those of us who are kind of trying to keep up with the news, we heard about all these different psychological programs. And when you were basically explaining the impact of the people who were in the camps, and earlier you had mentioned that about 20% of the Uyghur population are considered unsafe by the categorization that the state had created. But I'm wondering about the psychological impact on the rest of the population who are not in the camps. But, I was reading, for example, a story about how Uyghur children are kind of forced to write letters to their fathers who are in camps, how much they hate their father now because their father's not Chinese enough, you know. And these seems to be like these psychological techniques at the level of quotidian life, of the Uyghurs, that it is becoming, this war on terror has become almost like common sense. So if you could kind of expand on this outside of the camps life, and you know how it's connected to the camps obviously, but this kind of psychological impact that seems to be much bigger than only those in the camps.
Yeah. Well, it's important to know that to kind of mark that, 10 to 20% of the population, which is, a million or so,
Right.
maybe, up to 1.8 million
Mm-hmm.
people, and these are just rough estimates. We don't have exact figures, have been taken to the camps. Those people that were taken to the camps are from the adult population. So, and they're primarily, young adults, people between the ages of 20 and 55. So from that part of the population, it's an even more significant proportion, which means that family separation has become sort of endemic throughout the society. So many people have, a member of their family that's been taken to the camps. Many children are without one of their parents. Many children have been sent to live in boarding schools. Even if they have both parents at home, they're still being sent to live in boarding schools, which means that they're only able to visit their family, once or twice per month at the most. And in the boarding school, like, language instruction is in Chinese, it's Mandarin. All the teachers are now all Han people. Of course, there's no Islamic practice, no discussion of Islam. Even Uyghur language itself is not permitted. One of my friends told me that his sister, who's in a middle school, just started high school, said that at the high school, the teachers told them that there's monitoring equipment that will detect if they speak Uyghur. And so everyone inside the buildings never speaks Uyghur. She doesn't, it's hard to verify if that's true or not, but that's what they're told. They said that, she said that when they go around the exercise track outside, they still kind of whisper to each other in Uyghur. And so she said she's never going to forget her language, but that's the sort of pressure that's being placed on these children, is to stop speaking. And along with that is a sort of internalized form of feelings of lack and blame. So Uyghur children in many cases now are starting to see their parents as the reason why this is happening to them. They're starting to see Islam, starting to see kind of their Uyghur identity as something that is lacking in comparison to Han or Chinese identity. And so there's a kind of forms of self-loathing that people are internalizing through that process. Also, being separated from your parents for long periods of time, not understanding that your parents can't protect you, means that all kinds of kind of psychological trauma is being enacted on these children. One of the people I interviewed in Kazakhstan in January said that her nephews have been sent to a boarding school, kind of state-run orphanage, because both of their parents have been taken to the camps, and that on once or twice per month they're allowed to visit their grandparents, but she said that when they come, they don't talk at all. They're just completely silent. They've kind of become sort of shells of who they were just a year or two ago. So there's lots of trauma that's happening. I think the state feels as though the next generation of Uyghurs will be fully assimilated because they're growing up in this sort of residential school system. But I think they're not taking into account the kind of trauma that these kids are going through, that being separated from their parents, being told that they're worthless, or that their identity is worthless, and that they need to embrace this new identity. And then at the same time, always understanding that they look different, that they can never fully assimilate, even if they try as hard as they want. There's always going to be this racialized boundary that will prevent them from getting to the into the space of the colonizer. All of that is built into this, and makes it really difficult to really understand what the future is going to hold for the Uyghurs. So people won't forget their identity. I mean, we see that from other examples, you know, in North America with residential schools for Native Americans. Like, you know, it was a traumatic process. Many people died. People have been scarred for life through that process. But like, they didn't forget, you know, that they were Native American. They just know that the state did something really horrific to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a. I just have a comment. I mean, that's pretty very serious and extreme, because you know, when you think about the native population, the way they were depopulated, you know, it was the rate of that depopulation was so high, and the kind of apparatus that you're explaining, it's so, the magnitude of it is so huge that, and the, so it's a very scary situation. And yeah, that's, thank you for all these insights.
Yeah, you know, listening to this stuff is actually, it's very difficult to hear, man, because it's really heartbreaking to think about what these people are going through, and it's so gratuitous, you know. It's so you know, it's messed up, man. I'm trying to, you know, pass through these questions, but I'm also just you know, it's really terrible to think about what they're going through, man. It's really sad. And yeah, so I just wanted to acknowledge that for a second, and with everyone viewing too, I'm sure that other people are feeling that, you know, that this is a very serious, heavy thing that we're witnessing, that's happening to human beings. That's completely unnecessary, uncalled for, and you know, this is something that even if we're so callous as to not care, this is going to affect us in our lifetime. The implications of this is going to affect us in our lifetime. So I wanted to acknowledge that, and I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge their humanity, you know, and to acknowledge their dignity as people, because this is terrible to think about people being treated like animals, you know. And despite the fact of whatever the People's War does against them, or whatever is being done to them, that they're still human beings, and whatever they've had to do to survive, that we still respect their dignity as human beings, you know. And then I guess, having said all that, we have, I guess, like maybe one final question. I don't know exactly how we're doing on time, but I wanted to ask also, and I feel you've kind of touched on this, but I guess maybe, like, you know, currently right now, and going forward, what does the Islamic practice look like for them? You know, considering all of these factors in place, for those people who are, I don't know, I guess not in camps, and, you know, the broader community, you know, how does the Islamic practice look right now, you know, as of today, for the Islamic community of Uyghurs?
And to add just a little bit to Hannibal's question, what is, how are the Uyghurs thinking about the global Muslim world? And it seems like there is quite a bit of lack of action, particularly some states, and that have certain degree of influence. Of course, there's all this geopolitical complexity, but yeah. So what, you know, Hannibal's question, of course, but to add, like, how are they thinking about themselves as, if at all, connection to the ummah, to the global community?
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of what's happening right now in the Islamic practice, when I was doing my fieldwork in 2014 and 2015, like during the Friday prayer at the big Friday mosque in the city, like there would be more people than could fit inside the mosque. Like they were, you know, out on the street praying, you know, facing the mosque because they couldn't fit inside. Now there's virtually no one going to the mosque. So if there are people, it's elderly people, you know, people in their 80s, or, you know, people that feel as though the state doesn't care about, doesn't see them as a threat any longer. The mosques have, face recognition enabled scanning checkpoints. So you have to use your ID to get inside. And the state knows immediately if you've been to the mosque. And so anyone who thinks that they could be sent to the camp has stopped going to the mosque. In some cases, the mosques have been turned into kind of museum spaces and sort of tourist spaces for Han people that are visiting the region. So that's one of the things the state is now promoting is tourism. They said everything is so safe. You can go there. You can look at the wonderful architecture, the empty streets that are still there. And the Uyghurs, will treat you really well now because they understand who's in charge, that sort of thing. So the mosques are empty. During Ramadan, what we're seeing is the local officials or the people, they refer to themselves as relatives, that they become like the older brother, older sister to Uyghur families. They're visiting the people's homes during the day to make sure that people eat, that they're not fasting. It looks like in the pictures you see that come out of these spaces, it just looks like an eating tour. Like they're just eating all day long to make sure that people aren't fasting even for a minute during Ramadan. So that's the kind of violation, the kind of tight control, the sort of intimacy of the colonial violence is, in every aspect of daily life.
So just to reflect on that, when they're out and they're trying to fast for Ramadan, they're forcing them to eat. And then when they're in the camps hungry, they're starving them.
That's true. That's true. I'm sure in the camps they're also making them eat, at least 3 times a day, but they're not giving them actual, enough sustenance. And that's mostly because of the dehumanization and not caring about them, just seeing them as disposable. But yeah, that's an interesting point. Like I said, like people still find ways to practice Islam, but it's really, really, heavily mediated by the state presence. So one of the things that the state has done is they've said, it's no longer permitted to have what they call simple weddings, which is if people were practicing forms of piety that would, make them want to refrain from singing and dancing and things like that. They would sometimes not have that at their wedding. Now the state says you have to have a big celebration, lots of singing and dancing, has to be a big party. They often make them sing the national anthem at the beginning of the wedding. They send like state representatives to the wedding. Oftentimes like the Han relative is like a major figure. Sometimes they officiate the wedding. They make them sometimes dress in like Han clothes for the wedding, which is like, like a red dress. And anyway, it's like totally alien to their culture, to their religious practice. It's, non-Islamic form. They're making people, they say they're standardizing funerals, which means that they are cremating people's bodies and putting them in mausoleums instead of, Islamic burials. If they do have an Islamic burial, if that's permitted, the funeral itself is very small, like maybe only 10 people are permitted to come. Whereas in the past, it was this big, celebration big event, not celebration. And, sometimes they would have those Islamic teachers that would come. Like that's, of course, not happening any longer. So all these life rituals that are important parts of Islamic practice, those things are now tightly controlled. And of course, teaching children about Islam is something that's, you would do, under penalty of like detention. The children are being quizzed, regularly in school about the Islamic practice of their parents. So that's how Islam is being controlled. Like I said, though, they find ways to move forward. In terms of your question, Tanzeen, Uyghurs that are abroad, they see themselves as part of the global ummah. And I think there is a certain population of people abroad, especially people not maybe in state-appointed positions, that are identifying with what's happening to the Uyghurs and really seeing this as a major issue. So I know like in places like Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Bangladesh and other places, like there's been large protests in support of the Uyghurs.
That's right.
And in general, though, I think a number of Muslim majority countries are the governments that are in charge of those spaces are pretty tightly allied with the Chinese government, mostly in terms of trade and things like that. And also in some cases, they're not willing to intervene or make statements about what's happening in another country because they don't want that in turn to be happening in their country. They don't want the UN or something to intervene in their own country. And so I think that makes in terms of like at least official denunciations of what's happening to the Uyghurs, it makes it more difficult. The other thing that the Chinese state has done and is very good at doing is they've really tried to control the narrative about what's happening in the camps.
Yeah.
In some cases, they've opened up some camps or they've set up some camps for visitors, for diplomats and for journalists. And they've presented them as like, a Chinese version of countering violent extremism or something where this population is being de-radicalized and taught how to, practice Islam. And then they have, students that they will interview that will say, yes, this is, I came here voluntarily. I've learned so much about how not to be radical and things like that. So basically those visits are a way of sort of presenting a false narrative. They're a Potemkin style presentation of what's actually happening in the camp. The visitors never see the prison-like aspects of it. They don't see, people being shackled and hooded. They don't see people being forced to sit on these stools for long periods of time, being forced to denounce Islam and all of that. The Chinese state media is very strong. They control the narrative in a lot of ways in the way that China presents the message to other places. And I think some governments in other places, they're very willing to accept that narrative as a way of sort of excusing their relationship with China. So I think there's kind of a lack of political will to speak because there's going to be economic costs associated with speaking out.
Yeah, thanks for answering that. I have one question. It feels like I was reading article and I wanted to see if you had any insights or observations, or from your research, if you have any information, that the state was encouraging, because we talked about Uyghur men and how they're specifically targeted because of the military age and the question of feeling the security state, the security apparatus. But I read some article where it was talking about, and I don't think I'm mistaken, how they were encouraging the Chinese to basically forcibly sleep with Uyghur women. I mean, that's a technique. The rape structure is a very kind of basic technique of settler colonization. So I'm wondering at that level, we are, if that's not widespread, if you're basically seeing that as coming up in the future, and this is a potential, this degree of violence and basically a genocidal structure to the way they're being treated, and changing their the fear of them as a racially different group, and changing them and having all the different techniques of genocide, the physical, the biological, and the cultural. And so I wanted to just hear your observations on that, and if you had anything.
Yeah, so the way that anthropologists who've looked at sort of ethnic relations in China have talked about the way that this dynamic works is oftentimes that women of ethnic minorities are seen as sort of exotic relative to Han men or the Han population in general. The Han population often describes or sees themselves as sort of civilized and as not having identity, not having any sort of anything. It's just similar to the way whiteness works in the US, where oftentimes white people just think, oh, that's just the normal form of being in the world. Han people see themselves in a similar way in China. They see themselves as like at the center of civilization, and these minorities as being either exotic or being sort of dangerous. And so typically the women are seen as sort of exotic, and Uyghur women in particular are seen as quite alluring to kind of the Han male gaze. And that's, you know, historically been the case. They often, like, all of the sort of things that, like, you know, Edward Said might have talked about in Orientalism, and the way Muslim women are framed in other places, like, is being used in a similar way. So like they think that, you know, Uyghur women are like these exotic dancers that, you know, just want to like belly dance all day, and like that they're sexually promiscuous and things like that. So that's sort of some of the framing that comes into the way that the state sees Uyghur women. In terms of like being forced to sleep with them, so as part of this campaign, the state has assigned over 1.1 million state workers to act as relatives to the Uyghur families and Kazakh families. And the way that they assigned them was to families who are missing a family member that's been sent to the camp, because those families were seen as the most susceptible to like religious extremism, and so they have to be monitored the most closely. And so that meant that there's lots of families where the man has been taken, man of the house. And oftentimes the relatives that were sent were men, were Han men. And so there's many cases where, you know, the visitor that's coming to your home and you can't refuse is a Han man. And then one of the Kazakh women I interviewed in Kazakhstan in January told me that in her village, oftentimes the relatives, when they came, they would encourage the women to drink with them, and that's framed as like a test of their religiosity. So like, you know, if you refuse to drink alcohol, it means that you're religious. You have no other reason for not drinking alcohol, and so they would force them to drink with them, force them to dance with them, that sort of thing. In terms of like what actually happens in that space, it's not clear. I mean, people don't want to talk about sexual violence that's happened to them because it's, you know, it's very difficult to talk about those things. And also, if you do, like, you could be punished for talking about it. And so a lot of it's hidden, I think. In many of the homes where people are doing these visits, there's a single bed. It's like that has to do with like the housing structure itself. It's like a raised bed, which a lot of family activity happens on that space. And so, you know, in many cases, they're sleeping in the same room, on the same bed. It's not clear if that moves, you know, if it moves into something more than just simply being in the same room or not. But I think it does. And this Kazakh woman I interviewed in January said that many people divorced their husbands as a result of these visits. It's not clear if that was because like they were just choosing to instead, you know, be with this Han relative that was staying with them, or if it was that they wanted the visits to stop. And she thought that it was mostly because they wanted the visits to stop, because if you've disassociated yourself with this person that's in the camp, then you'll no longer be assigned a relative. So that's one of the dynamics. Another thing that's been happening quite a lot is with single women that are not married, Uyghurs and Kazakhs. They're often matched with Han people that have been coming to their village as volunteers. There's dance parties that happen frequently, and so, you know, in order to prove that you're not religious, you have to go to these dance parties. And if a Han person asks you to marry them, it's very difficult to refuse. There's lots of pressure put on the family and the person, the woman, to accept. There's often gifts that are given to both the woman and the person that's entering, the Han person entering into the relationship. They'll give them land, a house, you know, things like that. And then they often talk about them as being like a model marriage of ethnic harmony and progress. So there's lots of pressure to allow sexual violence to be permitted and to continue. At this point, it's not clear like what the scale is of these sort of state instituted marriages or, you know, sexual violence in the home. But I think, you know, over time we'll find out more, you know, that this is more widespread than we've seen evidence for so far. In any case, it's a traumatic experience for many people.
especially if everybody has to take potentially a relative, a Han relative, that seems like structured.
Yeah, yeah, it's not a pleasant experience. And in the manuals that those relatives use, they talk about how, you know, initially the people might refuse you. They might not tell you the truth. And so you should bring candy with you and befriend the children, and, you know, get the children off to the side and ask them, you know, after you've befriended them, you know, ask them the real questions about religion and all of that. Because they said the children won't lie. The children are innocent. They'll tell you the truth. So they're working the family structure against itself.
Interesting to the fact that they're in that sense they're using a tactic which pedophiles and kidnappers use. You know, to use children to use candy to lure children to violate them and perpetrate things against them.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Darren. We're kind of running out of time. I just want to thank you, and I want to say that you're welcome to join our platform with more information on Uyghur Muslims. It's a definite concern of our media project to make sure we investigate the Uyghur condition, that we condemn the situation that's happening to our brothers and sisters in China, and we're struggling. And it's a special month of Ramadan. I encourage all the Muslims to make dua for them, and so that even their suffering is a form of purification for them, and that they're also that the Uyghurs become free from this kind of oppression, and they're able to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without any inhibition. Thank you so much to all the listeners, the viewers. Thank you, Hannibal, for co-moderating today. So that's it for today. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.